Good morning. Welcome to today's Hazardous Waste Management Plan Workshop number 7. My name is Alejandro Vivas. On behalf of the Department of Toxic Substances Control, I'd love to welcome you to today's webinar. I want to go over a couple of housekeeping items before we get started, just so everyone has an easier time operating the presentation today on Zoom. First off, we have language and captions available to everyone. You can go ahead and go down to your interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and select whether you'd like to hear this presentation in English or Spanish. If you're on your phone, keep in mind it'll be a little bit different. You're going to want to go down to the ellipsis, the little icon that says more, and press that icon, and it'll take you to language interpretation. Once you press that, you can decide again whether or not you'd like to listen to this presentation in English or Spanish. Next slide, please. All right, a couple of other housekeeping items. Please keep in mind that it's a lot easier to run this program on Chrome, Safari, or Firefox. And we're going to be enabling the Q&A box for today's session, so that if you have any questions, go ahead and put those in the Q&A. The camera and the microphone features have been disabled, so that's how we're going to communicate today's back and forth. Please keep in mind also, this session is being recorded, as have all our other workshops. So if you've missed other workshops and you'd like to take a look at what you've missed, go ahead and go to our website and you'll find them there. Now, also, we're going to send out a session evaluation at the end, so please go ahead and fill that out to let us know how we're doing and how we can improve in the future. Next slide, please. Now, you can also, as I mentioned, go to our DTSC Hazardous Waste Management Plan website. You'll find more information and also past webinars that have been recorded. Felice has put those in the chat for you. You can also join our e-list for updates so that you can keep apprised as to what's going on simply by subscribing to our site, and we'll always be sending you updates via email. Our email address also, if you have specific questions you'd like to reach out to us about, go ahead and email us at dtsc_hwplan@dtsc.ca.gov. Now, up on the screen, we also have a QR code. You can go ahead and click on that, and it'll take you straight to our website. Next slide. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Ryan Dominguez. He's our supervising hazardous substance engineer, and he's going to kick off today's workshop. Go ahead, Ryan.
Great, thanks, Alejandro. Hi, everybody. As Alejandro said, my name is Ryan Dominguez. I'm the supervising hazardous substances engineer for the Hazardous Waste Management Plan unit. Thanks for joining us again today. Please bear with us. We've been having some technical issues this morning, had a little power outage on the cameras and some issues with our PowerPoint, but I think we got it all mostly squared away. So it's been an adventure. So yeah, thanks again for sitting with us in this one. This is our 6th workshop of the series. And for this, we've teamed up with DTSC's Waste Evaluation and Recycling Unit. This series was developed to provide ongoing public education and encourage continued discussions during development of the Hazardous Waste Management Plan. These workshops discuss focused topics that are based on public feedback that we've received over the last 2 years, and it provides additional information related to the development of the Hazardous Waste Management Plan. So now we're in the back half of our workshop series. So far, we've done a deeper dive into the data sources that we're using and how some of those sources may be used in the future. We've discussed potential changes to waste codes that we're currently considering. We've talked about what a future pollution prevention type program might include. And we've had an expanded conversation about capacity with the supply and demand of hazardous waste. And finally, we've provided information about an initiative that DTSC's Brownfields group is heading that is working to produce a guide for practitioners to adopt a community lens when designing a cleanup. Each workshop has been recorded, so if you've missed any, or want to go back and watch those presentations again, please visit our Hazardous Waste Management Plan workshop page. The workshop dates and topics are subject to change, so please also join our e-list to receive updates. With that, let's go to the next slide, and we'll do a quick poll. There's 4 questions, I think, in this one. There we go. Okay, so yeah, if folks could go ahead and fill this out real quick. And while you're filling that out, I just wanted to remind folks that our slides are on our website currently, so you can go and reference the slides there. There's also a number of other reference material, background reading. Okay, so let's go ahead and close that out and get the results. So we had a few questions here. Have you read our 2023 report? About 70% is no. Have you attended our workshops in the past? It's about 50-50. And we have a spread of familiarity or knowledge of hazardous waste criteria, with, I'd say, about a little over 70% sitting in the high level concepts and a good understanding. There's a handful of 5 with almost no familiarity, and a few more with strong level of knowledge and mastery. So welcome to everybody. With that, I do like to give a little background on what this project is for those who are new or haven't attended many of the workshops in the past. So in 2021, Senate Bill 158 was approved, and it made changes to Health and Safety Code 25135. The changes require the department to complete hazardous waste management reports that will feed information into hazardous waste management plans. In 2023, DTSC published the first hazardous waste management report. DTSC is using the information in that report to draft the first hazardous waste management plan. The draft plan will be presented to the Board of Environmental Safety for approval, and then the cycle starts again. This is an iterative process, and we are currently using the information from that report and feedback that we've received over the last couple of years to help develop the hazardous waste management plan. Now, the plan itself will include specific goals and recommendations that relate to the information that we're discussing throughout these 10 workshops. Next slide, please. Now, as a reminder, you can access our 2023 full report on our webpage. We recommend reading the full report and reviewing the appendices. There's also a number of different resources that we've put in on our website on the workshop link for this workshop related to hazardous waste criteria. Data from the report and your comments are being used to help inform for the development of the plan. You can access the website using the QR code here on the screen. Next slide, please. So we've identified 4 areas of focus for hazardous waste management planning. Today's workshop will be a deep dive into the hazardous waste criteria. This is a complex subject, and one of the goals today is to provide an expanded discussion on the criteria that has been covered in prior workshops. Now, given the complexity of the issue, it is not expected that you will walk away feeling like you know everything about the criteria. Rather than a mastery of the subject, we hope the information presented today will provide additional context to help you understand the criteria more than you do at this point right now. We have provided a general introduction to the hazardous waste criteria in a workshop in July of 2022. There's a recording on our website. In addition, Section 8 of our November 2023 report includes a discussion of the hazardous waste criteria. And lastly, there is a self-paced hazardous waste classification training on DTSC's website as well. Now, in combination with today's presentation and these resources, They provide many avenues to help understand the process and testing methodologies that are used to identify hazardous waste in California. Next slide, please. The hazardous waste criteria are used to identify those wastes that are required to be managed as hazardous. One of the best ways to better understand hazardous waste criteria is to discuss them in context of the process that generators use to determine if their waste must be managed as hazardous waste. Now, we will be discussing this process today. With regard to criteria for identifying hazardous waste, SB 158 requires 3 different kinds of analyses for DTSC's reports. These inform 3 different kinds of recommendations in the plan. Now, we've been working in this area to gather information and identify areas that we will be researching and making recommendations. And there's 3 main areas that we will be working in over the next several years. So we're looking for chemicals or waste that may pose emerging threats to the human health of the environment. Next, we're evaluating the regulatory thresholds for non-RCRA criteria to determine if they are protective enough or if conditions have changed in the years since the thresholds were developed. And lastly, we'll be evaluating analytical testing methods for methods like the fish bioassay and the waste extraction test. Now, these subjects will be covered during today's presentation. We will have time for questions and comments at the end of the presentation, and we'll also have about a 5-minute break towards the middle. Now, on that topic, please keep your questions or comments related to this presentation and not about specific situations. Questions about very specific waste streams or specific questions asking for assistance with waste characterization will not be addressed here today. You can submit those questions to us via our email, and we can help direct you to the most appropriate contact in DTSC. So with that, I will turn it over to Trent and Lubna.
Go ahead, next slide. Thanks, Ryan. The first step in dealing properly with hazardous waste is to be able to know one when we see it. We would say to identify them. Everything else about hazardous waste management and regulation hinges on the determination of which materials are under the jurisdiction of the hazardous waste control law and which are not. That's where the criteria come in. With regard to the criteria for identifying hazardous waste, Senate Bill 158 requires 3 different kinds of analyses for DTSC's reports, informing 3 different kinds of recommendations in the plans. As we discuss these, keep in mind that though it won't always be expressed in words on the slides, every analysis and every recommendation must have protection of human health and the environment as their first objective. Everything we will discuss today must pass through that filter first. With that said, DTSC is required to assess whether our criteria, which are more expansive than the minimum standards of the federal system, are providing necessary and effective protection for the people of California and its environment. DTSC is to use that analysis to inform recommendations regarding waste that are hazardous only in California, which may be managed under different standards while still protecting human health and the environment, or which may need to be managed under stricter standards in order to be protective. DTSC is also required to assess whether California's criteria for identifying hazardous waste are up to date with current science, technology, and testing methods. We're to use that analysis as the basis to make recommendations for updates to our criteria, reflecting those advances. And last, we're required to assess whether there are any additional hazardous chemical constituents or hazardous properties of waste that should be accounted for in California's criteria. And DTSC is to use this analysis to inform recommendations for additions to its criteria. Today's workshop is being hosted to ensure that the public is well informed about California's criteria for identifying hazardous wastes. That will ensure that the feedback we receive from you prior to making recommendations or adopting regulations is the best it can be. An overview of the current criteria will be covered later in today's workshop. However, in order to understand where we are with the criteria, it's important not to forget how we got here. That history will be covered in the first part of today's workshop, beginning now. As we think about how California's hazardous waste identification came to be, it's important to remember that almost every aspect of them can be traced back to some incident that cost someone their life or damaged their health or property or the environment. I want to tell you about two examples of hazardous waste mismanagement that occurred, or at least have their origins, back in the years before regulation began. I'll color code those in red to indicate those grave costs. Santa Fe Springs, California is located between Anaheim and Los Angeles. In the mid-1950s, a dump site in that city called Marathon Cartage started receiving drums of what we would now call hazardous waste paint solvents. By 1980, when it was discovered by inspectors from the predecessor of DTSC, it contained between 12,000 and 20,000 such drums, many corroded and leaking, stacked up to 6 high on pallets. By the way, the picture shown here of the drums is not from that site, but it represents a small-scale scene similar to the kinds of mismanaged drums that were found there. Also note that the map shown is from 2024 data. The cleanup of the disposal site was delayed by legal wrangling between potential responsible parties. Then, in July of the next year, a fire broke out at that site, which was suspected to be an incidence of arson. The explosion from that fire was compared to a small atom bomb that resulted in drums shooting off like lethal missiles and landing in nearby properties. It took 120 firefighters to battle that blaze, injuring 8 of them, 2 seriously enough to put them in the hospital. Some of the liquid waste that didn't burn leaked into nearby Coyote Creek, which feeds into the San Gabriel River. This killed 250,000 fish and prompted the closure of Seal Beach for a time until testing could show whether it was safe for people to swim there. To fund the cleanup, the dump site became the second ever to access money from the Federal Comprehensive Environmental Response, Cleanup, and Liability Act, or CERCLA, and also known as Superfund. That was just days after the very first Superfund award was made to the Love Canal community near Niagara Falls, New York. I'll look across the country for my next example for hazardous waste mismanagement. In the 1960s, the Hoffman-Taft Chemical Company in Verona, Missouri, produced a chemical that was part of the herbicide mixture known as Agent Orange. You may have heard of that herbicide for its past military applications. One of the byproducts of the reactions used to make that chemical was an extremely toxic carcinogenic chemical called a dioxin. In the early 1970s, the chemical company contracted with a man named Russell Bliss to remove the dioxin that was being stored in its tanks. Bliss's solution for what to do with it was to mix it with waste oil and then spray that mixture around the area and on roads as a dust suppressant, most notably in the town of Times Beach, Missouri. Dozens of horses and many other animals were killed by that poison, and some children were made very sick. When the Merrimack River flooded in 1982, the entire town was bought out and abandoned so the land could be cleaned up under Superfund. After years of work, the site of the former town was turned into a state park, and testing indicates that it's now safe for people to use. Look, we could go on for longer than we have today, discussing many incidents, including some with fatalities, in which hazardous wastes were mismanaged in the past, and we will sprinkle in a few more stories along the way. But for now, we'll turn our attention to the story of how the state and the federal government finally took action to protect residents from hazardous waste, with a special emphasis on the development of the criteria for identifying those wastes. In 1972, California enacted the Hazardous Waste Control Act. I'll color code actions at the state level in green. Among other things, the act defined hazardous waste as any waste material or mixture of wastes which is toxic, corrosive, flammable, and irritant, a strong sensitizer, or which generates pressure through decomposition, heat, or other means. Now, some of those terms overlap with the hazardous characteristics we still think of today, but others do not. That law also mandated the Department of Health, which was the department from which DTSC would eventually emerge, to develop and adopt a list of waste that it had determined to be hazardous or extremely hazardous wastes. The team that took on all of hazardous waste regulation in California originally had just 4 staff members. And by the very next year, those workers had their list in the regulations. But how did they know what to put in it? Well, one source of information for them was a growing list of incidents that had resulted in harm to human health or the environment. For example, one report that the department knew about involved lead poisoning. The chemical tetraethyl lead, used to make leaded gasoline decades ago, was produced in large quantities in the Bay Area. One of the waste from that chemical's production, called tetraethyl lead sludge, was a waste that could be processed to recover additional product. So there was a production plant and a recovery plant and a transportation route between the two that happened to cross the Carquinez Bridge. Workers who collected tolls on that bridge were exposed to fumes escaping from the trucks that hauled tetraethyl lead sludge to the recovery facility, and they suffered severe lead poisoning. For that matter, the workers at the recovery plant were also poisoned, and several horses living near the transportation route in southern Solano County died. Department staff were able to correlate damage incidents like this with the information on liquid waste hauler records, which were the forerunners of the hazardous waste manifests, and that was one source of information for putting together its list. The department's list contained 650 chemicals that were, as wastes, hazardous wastes, as well as 66 that were extremely hazardous wastes. These regulations were adopted as an emergency rulemaking in 1973, and then by the regular rulemaking process in 1974. According to those regulations, a waste was hazardous under either of these conditions. One, the waste met the definition of hazardous waste found in the statute, which, as we've seen, defined hazardous waste as being one that was toxic, corrosive, flammable, a strong sensitizer, etc. Or 2, if the waste was a chemical found on one of the lists in the regulations. However, each of these ways that a waste
Cada
could
uno de
qualify.
estos desechos
However, each of these
sin
ways that a
embargo, cada
waste.
uno de estos,
I'm sorry, we're getting a little bit of the interpreter, I think, bleeding into our feed here.
this is a Spanish interpreter. I believe I was kicked out from the Spanish channel. We'll hold on with Alejandro and you may proceed. We'll take care of that on the back end. You may continue. Sorry for the interruption.
It's okay.
Okay, no worries.
Thank you. However, each of these ways that a waste could qualify as hazardous had a major flaw. First, most of the hazardous properties listed in the statutory definition of hazardous waste did not have clear standards specified in any law or regulation. How would you know if your waste was toxic enough or a strong enough sensitizer? Of those terms, only flammable was defined by a test result, and that was only for liquid wastes. Also, the lists of hazardous waste in the regulations were fine for waste that were in pure chemical form. But what if the waste was a mixture that had the listed hazardous chemical in it as just one constituent? In those cases, the generator was required to perform analytical tests and then send them to the department to have staff evaluate whether it was actually hazardous. This task was very burdensome, both on the time of the generators and even more so on the department, which didn't have the staff resources to handle the volume of inquiries efficiently. Clearly, there was a need to codify a better defined set of criteria that waste generators could use to determine if their wastes were hazardous. And that was just about to happen, not only for California, but for the whole nation. That's because in 1976, the US Congress enacted the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA. I'll color code federal actions in blue. RCRA established the Office of Solid Waste within the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and tasked it with administering hazardous waste regulation at the federal level. It mandated the office to write regulations for the federal hazardous waste identification criteria. Then in 1977, the California legislature followed suit, mandating the Department of Health to establish California's own criteria and guidelines for identifying hazardous wastes. In 1980, US EPA began rolling out regulations for the Federal Hazardous Waste Program, including their criteria for hazardous waste identification. As mandated under RCRA, their system includes a two-pronged approach to identifying hazardous wastes: the list of hazardous wastes and the characteristics of hazardous waste. I'll describe both of those briefly here, with more to come later. There are 4 lists of waste that the US EPA has found to essentially always be hazardous. These are called the F, K, P, and U lists. I'll describe each of those further in a few minutes, but what you can know about them for now is that there are clear guidelines in the regulations for whether a given waste is covered by any of the lists. Then there are the characteristics of hazardous waste. When we say characteristics, we mean the properties of the waste that make them dangerous to human health or the environment. Briefly, those are the characteristic of ignitability, based on whether a waste could easily catch fire; corrosivity, based on how acidic or basic a water-based solution is, or how fast any liquid can corrode metals; reactivity, which is based on whether a waste could readily explode or react dangerously; and last, the characteristic of toxicity is based on whether the waste has certain chemicals in it that could readily poison human health or the environment. For most of these characteristics, whether a waste passes or fails is based on the results of analytical tests, and there are clearly stated thresholds, a bright white line defining what is hazardous waste and what is not. In 1984, the California Department of Health Services, as it was known by then, adopted our own criteria for identifying hazardous waste. In fact, this coming Sunday, October 27th, represents the 40-year anniversary of when those criteria first became effective. And most of the California-specific criteria are effectively the same today as when they were first adopted. When they were first adopted, California's regulations focused on the characteristics of hazardous waste, using the same 4 characteristics as the federal criteria, though some had different standards, most notably the characteristic of toxicity. We'll discuss California's criteria for hazardous characteristics later in this presentation as a major topic, so hold that thought. But for now, for the next several years, starting in late 1984, Californians were under both the federal criteria and California's criteria as separate systems. However, in the early 1990s, hazardous waste regulation in California was about to undergo another set of changes. First, the department completed a years-long process of adopting regulations to align California's system with the federal rules, integrating the federal criteria into our own. Now, waste generators could use a single system.
Esos generadores pueden utilizar el sistema para determinar si se reglamenta o no. Ese mismo
Part of a process by which California was seeking to become authorized under RCRA to administer its
sobre
own
el mismo.
The most important requirement for any state to become authorized is that its rules must be at least as broad in scope as the federal regulations, meaning that any waste that's identified as hazardous waste by the federal regulations must also be a hazardous waste under the rules of the state. And the state's management requirements must be at least as stringent as the federal rules. The US EPA granted California its RCRA authorization in 1992. One thing that's important to note is that when the department integrated the federal criteria into our system, it did not replace California's standards in those places where we had additional ways that a waste could be identified as hazardous. It effectively just added the federal criteria to them. Now hold on to that thought because it will be important later. Well, just a couple of weeks after those regulations became effective, the Toxic Substances Control Program within the Department of Health Services was elevated to its own department status, now under the California Environmental Protection Agency. In other words, DTSC was officially born. In the years since RCRA authorization, there have been some changes to the criteria. First, the US EPA has added several waste to its list of hazardous waste and has made some changes to the characteristics of hazardous waste, such as changes to the characteristic of ignitability, which we'll discuss later. As for California's additional criteria for identifying hazardous waste, which we refer to as the non-RCRA criteria, perhaps the biggest change happened in 2003. That's when DTSC added our own list of hazardous waste, the M list, for mercury-containing products that become wastes. DTSC has taken other opportunities to evaluate and propose changes to the non-RCRA criteria. The most significant of these was in the late 1990s when DTSC undertook a project called the Regulatory Structure Update, or RSU. One result of that review was a proposal for major changes to the criteria for the characteristic of toxicity, which, as I've mentioned, is the part of our standards that have the most non-RCRA criteria. While some of the proposed changes under the RSU were adopted, the toxicity criteria changes were not. Comments from the National Academy of Sciences and from the legislature were among the reasons that persuaded the department to continue its research before adopting any changes. Therefore, those proposed changes were never adopted. Now, as a result of Senate Bill 158 of 2021, DTSC has a new mandate to evaluate and recommend changes to its non-RCRA hazardous waste criteria. So that brings us to the hazardous waste criteria themselves, which we want for you, the public, to understand well so that you can provide us with the most useful feedback. Those criteria are best discussed in the context of the process that generators use to determine if their waste must be managed as a hazardous waste. We call this the waste classification process. As before, I'll color code the parts of this process that are based on the federal rules in blue, and wastes that are identified under the federal system are called RCRA hazardous wastes. Also, as before, California's criteria that go beyond the federal are colored in green, and wastes that are regulated as hazardous in California, but not federally, are called non-RCRA hazardous wastes. So when you hear RCRA, think the federal rules. And when I say non-RCRA, it refers to a feature of California's criteria that goes beyond the federal system. The waste classification process can be summarized as a set of 4 questions that the waste generator can answer to determine if they must manage their material as a hazardous waste. It's important to state that it is the responsibility of the generator to determine if their material is a hazardous waste. To do this, they may use their knowledge of the waste or analytical testing where appropriate. First, I'll lay out all 4 questions, and then we'll spend more time unpacking each one just a bit. The first question is the material a waste? A material that is not a waste, according to the definition found in the regulations, cannot be a hazardous waste. If it is a waste, then the next 2 questions will reveal whether it is a hazardous waste. That's because there are 2 ways for a waste to be a hazardous waste. The first of these is if the waste is listed in any of the 4 federal lists of hazardous waste or in California's M list. And the second way is for the waste to exhibit a characteristic of hazardous waste. So if you answered yes to the first question on the slide, and also to one or both of the next 2 questions, it looks like you have a hazardous waste. Even so, there could be 1 or more exclusions that might get the material out of being a waste or a hazardous waste, or an exemption that might release it from certain requirements. Let's spend a bit more time looking at each of those questions in the waste classification process. The first question examines whether the material meets the definition of waste in section 66261.2 of Title 22 of the California Code of Regulations, which will be abbreviated as 22 CCR on the slides. And when I speak about it, I'll just call it Title 22. There are 2 broad ways that a material can be considered a waste. One that our criteria take from the federal regulations, and the other is specific to California. The most significant way that a material can be identified as a waste is to be a discarded material. As with the other terms, this one needs a bit more clarification. If first, a material is discarded if it is relinquished. I've colored that term a little differently because it's not exactly the same word used in the federal regulations, but it's really the same concept as its federal equivalent, which is abandoned. What it means is that you are finished with this material. You don't want to get anything more useful from it. You just want it to go away. Some waste can be relinquished by being disposed in a landfill, while others must be incinerated or burned up. Some waste could be treated in order to make them non-hazardous, but you need a permit or some other kind of authorization for that. And even if you haven't disposed or incinerated or treated your material yet, but you know that you'll have to, then they're already wastes. The second way for a material to be discarded is to be recycled. That means that they're no longer going to be used for what they were originally intended for, but it's still possible that you or someone else could get some use out of them. Now, this is a broad term covering a lot of different kinds of activities. Two of the most common forms of recycling are directly using or reusing a material, either as an ingredient or as in place of a new material that you'd have had to have bought, or performing some kind of treatment on it to make it usable again. Depending on which of those you're talking about and what your material is, that material may not even be considered a waste under the federal rules. But California's criteria keeps all hazardous waste recycling within its definition of wastes, though it may be excluded as we consider the last question in this process. Technically, even the actions of Russell Bliss, who you remember spread that dioxin-contaminated oil as a dust suppressant, even that's a form of recycling, but it's one that never would have been allowed. The last way to be considered discarded is if your material is inherently waste-like. Now, this designation applies only to a few niche kinds of waste that are considered too dangerous to recycle, such as dioxin-containing listed wastes. Beside being a discarded material, in California, a material can be considered a waste if it is being improperly stored. This can mean that the label is incorrect or missing or otherwise inadequate, or it's packaged in a damaged or deteriorated container. Either way, if the situation poses a current or potential threat to human health or the environment, and the problem isn't remedied within a certain time frame, the material becomes a waste and a hazardous waste. This is true even for materials that the generator may not think of as a waste. To them, it may be considered an ingredient they haven't used yet, but their lack of proper care renders the material a waste. Now, if the material is a waste, according to that first question, we move on to the second question. Is it listed? As I mentioned, there are 4 federal lists of hazardous waste, and California has one of its own. The federal lists include waste streams and chemicals that US EPA knows from their experience pose a threat to human health or the environment when they're discarded. Like all the federal hazardous wastes, listed wastes have a US EPA hazardous waste number that begins with a letter, in this case, F, K, P, or U, followed by 3 numerical digits. The F list is for certain wastes that come from manufacturing or treatment processes, but that mostly aren't specific to any one particular industry. For example, many solvents are ignitable or toxic or both. And so US EPA made a blanket statement that when certain kinds of these have become contaminated or unusable without further treatment, they are hazardous wastes unless they're excluded by some other provision. Remember, we still have to consider the exclusions and exemptions at the end of this process. The K list is for waste that come from processes within specific industries. There are over 100 wastes on this list from several industries, including manufacturing of organic chemicals or inorganic chemicals, petroleum refining, and the production of explosives, among others. For both the F and K lists, the descriptions in the regulations are worded very specifically to state whether a certain waste is identified by it or not. What's important about that is that if you have a waste that matches any of the listings, You don't have to do any analytical testing to know if it's hazardous or not. It is, unless it's excluded. The P and U lists are found together in the same section of the regulations, specifically section 66261.33 of Title 22. These are for chemicals that are unused, but become waste by being unwanted, expired, off specification, or spilled into the environment, or the residues remaining in their containers. The chemical itself had to be either essentially a pure formulation or was the sole active ingredient in its product. The difference between the two lists is that the P list is for wastes that are considered acute hazardous in the federal rules. That name, acute hazardous waste, refers to the fact that these wastes pose a threat at even when they are found at very low quantities or concentrations. Most of these are listed for their acute toxicity. That is, they can kill a person or poison the environment even in small quantities. The U list is for chemicals that are hazardous wastes, but not quite at the level of those of the P list. Last, we have California's list of hazardous waste, called the M list. It's for certain kinds of mercury-containing products when those products become wastes. One of the categories of waste on this list are products with mercury relay switches, such as the kind that used to be found in some greeting cards that would play a sound or a song when you opened them. The largest category of M-listed waste includes mercury-containing lamps, such as fluorescent light bulbs, but thankfully those can be managed as universal waste if you follow all the rules for that. Besides being listed, the other way for a waste to be a hazardous waste is if it displays one of the 4 characteristics of a hazardous waste. As I mentioned, those are ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, and toxicity. And the criteria for most of these are based on the results of analytical tests. We're going to do a deeper dive into those in just a few minutes, so hold on for now. The last question we ask in order to determine if a material is hazardous waste or not is it excluded or exempted? Those two words mean different things, so let's take a moment and break that down. If a material is excluded, then there is some provision in the law or regulation that gets it out of being a waste or hazardous waste, depending on the specifics of the exclusion. Many of the exclusions are for recycling activities to try to promote recovering those valuable resources whenever possible. And most of the exclusions are conditional, meaning that there are still some requirements for how the material must be managed. And if you don't follow those rules, you lose the exclusion. There are also exemptions. If you can claim one of these, the material is still a hazardous waste, but the exemption gets you out of certain requirements. For example, several exemptions allow relaxed rules for the transportation of hazardous wastes. Like with the exclusions, there are requirements that must be followed to keep the exemption. The US EPA has dozens of exclusions, and California has its own set. Now, some of California's exclusions overlap with the federal ones, and some are for chemicals that, because California's criteria are broader in scope, would never have been regulated as hazardous waste in the first place. But since California has not adopted all of the US EPA's exclusions, some materials that are federally excluded are still regulated as hazardous waste in our state. One example of this is household waste, which has an exclusion found in section 261.4 of Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, since California didn't adopt this exclusion, all of us in our households are almost certainly hazardous waste generators. However, California law does offer an exemption for household generators to manage their waste through their local household hazardous waste collection facilities. The last thing to say here is that some of California's exclusions and exemptions are found in the regulations, and some are found in the laws passed by the legislature and then signed by the governor. So for that reason, you'd have to know where to look to find all of them. And we don't have time to go into all of those today. And there's obviously much more to say about the other aspects of the waste classification process. So DTSC has provided resources to help the public learn more about it. Scanning the QR code here on the left side of this slide takes you to a recording of the presentation given by Diana Peebler in 2022, where she gives more details about the process, the criteria, and exclusions and exemptions. And the QR code now on the right side of the slide takes you to a set of web pages that lead you through a self-paced course on waste classification in California with much more detail and citations of the laws and regulations. For now, we've covered the waste classification process, and we're going to spend most of the rest of our time discussing the characteristics of hazardous waste. We're prioritizing these because they're where most of the non-RCRA criteria are found. And so these are the places where DTSC's recommendations and its authority to adopt regulations could potentially make the biggest difference in California. To begin that discussion, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Lubna Durrani of the Hazardous Waste Management Plan Unit.
Thank you, Trent, for sharing all these valuable details. Good morning, everyone. As Trent introduced me, this is Lubna Durrani. I'm the Senior Environmental Scientist with the Hazardous Waste Management Plan Unit. With that, next slide, please. Understanding all this information highlights the complexity of identifying hazardous waste criteria, which can be classified as either listed or characteristic waste. This process requires a thorough assessment to ensure safe management and compliance with regulations. So from now onward, we are only focusing on characteristic criteria in waste identification process. We will also share the future steps and the updates later in this presentation. Next slide, please. Before we go further, it's important to know who is responsible for identifying hazardous waste. You heard already, regulations place this duty on the waste generators. They must assess if their waste meets hazardous criteria, means either is listed or exhibit characteristic. Correct identification is crucial for safe management and compliance with environmental laws, protecting the public health and the environment. Next one, please. The characteristic hazardous waste are those identified by their properties that make them hazardous when improperly managed. And most of the characteristics are determined by analytical testing. There are 4 primary characteristics of hazardous waste recognized at both the federal and state levels. As you have heard earlier, these are ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, and toxicity. Each characteristic has specific regulatory requirements for determining whether the waste falls into one of these categories. While both the federal and the state of California use these 4 categories, there are important differences in how they are applied. For example, there are significant differences in how corrosivity and toxicity are defined in both sets of regulations, such as federal regulations consider corrosivity for liquid waste only. California also considers corrosivity for liquid waste, like federal. However, California has additional consideration for corrosivity of non-liquid waste as well. Similarly, there are vast differences found in the toxicity criteria, such as the federal regulations have one criterion used to identify waste as toxic, called TCLIP, which stands for Toxicity Characteristic Leaching Procedure, and is based on the toxic compound concentrations that would become soluble in a simulated landfill situation. Now, California has TCLIP for toxicity and have 8 additional criteria, including its own version of a simulated landfill test called WET, which stands for Waste Extraction Test. Now, all of these additional criteria for both of these characteristics leading to more waste being classified as hazardous in California as compared to US EPA's regulations for federal. The additional waste classified due to California's broader corrosivity and toxicity criteria are referred to as non-RCRA waste. You will learn about details of these differences and additional criteria later today. So let's hold on to these thoughts for now. Next one, please. Now, for remaining the two other characteristics, for instance, the ignitability and the reactivity criteria, California and federal used to have similar criteria. Initially, US EPA's criteria for both characteristics were adopted into the state of California's regulation as is. However, these criteria were established 40 years ago. Since then, the federal government has modified and updated its criteria multiple times, while California has not always adopted these changes. As a result, while ignitability and reactivity were once the same at both federal and state levels, some differences in the regulatory language have emerged over time due to ongoing federal revisions and modifications. We will be discussing those differences later today. Let's discuss each one of these characteristics in detail, what they are, why they were considered for waste criteria, and their existing status. Next slide, please. The first characteristic we are discussing today is California's criteria for ignitability. Ignitable waste can easily catch fire under certain conditions, meaning they can ignite when exposed to heat, flames, or sparks. Improper handling or storage of ignitable waste can lead to fires and explosions. These wastes are dangerous because they can ignite even at low temperatures. Fire caused by ignitable waste can damage property, harm the environment, and even result in loss of life. Many industrial materials such as paints, cleaners, solvents, as well as aerosol sprays like hairspray and cleaning sprays that we use every day pose this risk when they are discarded. The criteria of ignitability characteristic is outlined in the Title 22, Section 66261.21. This section is subdivided into 4 subsections, and I would explain this criteria in depth later. Before that, we need to understand that what led the regulators to consider ignitability as one of the waste criteria. Next slide, please. The reason this criterion was developed is due to numerous accidents in the past. Some of them were explained by Trent earlier, such as a fire incident in Santa Fe Springs in 1981, where a suspected arson fire caused a massive explosion, launching hazardous waste drums onto nearby properties. As you have heard earlier, the explosion had an impact like a small atom bomb, causing drums to launch like lethal missiles on nearby properties. It became very hard to get things under control afterwards. Like it took 120 firefighters to battle against the fire, and 8 of them got severe injuries. The incident also contaminated local water bodies, resulting in the death of massive number of fish. At that time, dangerous incidents frequently occurred because waste wasn't handled properly or people lacked the knowledge to manage it safely, posing significant risk to both people and the environment. Next one, please. Now, one such incident occurred during 1970s at an army base in Southern California. So during that incident, an explosion involving propellant waste took place during transportation. This tragic event resulted in the death of 2 workers. Just to share that this map is taken from 2024 map data and represents some of the military bases located at multiple places throughout the state, including Southern California. Next slide, please. Another major incident happened at one of the Iowa-based barrel and drum companies in the same era, where hazardous waste like paints and herbicides were processed improperly. This led to a series of multiple fires in the 1980s, and the company was shut down later, leaving behind thousands of barrels of hazardous waste. Later, the US EPA took over the cleanup under Superfund. These types of accidents leading to fires, explosions, and the release of toxic gases. To avoid such unfortunate incidents, the ignitability criteria was developed to protect both the public and the environment. The goal is to learn from the past and ensure a safe future. Now, let's look into what ignitability criteria refers to. Next slide, please. Ignitable waste can exist as liquids, solids, compressed gases, or oxidizers. But liquids with the low flash points are especially dangerous because they can spread quickly and ignite with ease. Earlier, I have briefly talked about 4 subsections of ignitability criteria. So these 4 subsections are explaining these 4 types of ignitable waste and their regulatory requirements. Understanding these ignitable waste is crucial for safe management to prevent fires, explosions, and environmental harm. So let's look into each one of them. Next one, please. The first ignitable waste type we are discussing today is the ignitability for liquids, which refers to liquids that can easily catch fire due to their low flash points and high volatility. Now, these wastes pose significant risks, including fires and explosions, which can lead to health hazards and the environmental damages. Next one, please. Now, both California and US EPA use the flash point test to determine whether a liquid waste is combustible. The flash point is the temperature at which a liquid can produce enough vapor to ignite. So regulations classify a liquid waste as ignitable if its flash point is below 140 degrees Fahrenheit or equivalent to 60 degrees Celsius when measured using closed cup testers. So many solvents used in industrial processes or household products such as paint thinners and acetones are ignitable. They evaporate quickly, creating flammable vapors that can easily ignite in the air. Next one, please. Now, the second ignitable waste type we are discussing today is the ignitability for non-liquids, means for solids. Ignitability for solids refers to materials such as metals that can catch fire through friction, moisture absorption, or spontaneously combust under normal conditions. To be classified as ignitable, these solids must burn vigorously enough to pose a hazard. Examples include magnesium, which ignites easily when exposed to heat and burns at extremely high temperatures. Another example is the white phosphorus, which can ignite at room temperature in the air. Both are highly flammable and can be dangerous if not handled properly. Next one, please. Now, the third category is ignitability for compressed gases. This refers to the risk of certain gases when compressed under pressure and causing fires or explosions when exposed to heat, flames, or sparks. Now, some gases are naturally flammable, while others become ignitable under high pressure or mixed with air. The danger increases with pressure as leaks can quickly create an explosive or highly flammable atmosphere. Examples are aerosol sprays, which can explode or catch fire if punctured or exposed to heat. Now, California's regulations on compressed gases are based on the old US Department of Transportation's regulations, which are abbreviated as USDOT, and which were updated years ago and are now outdated. For example, next one, please. California still references methods approved by the Bureau of Explosives, abbreviated as BOE, which is no longer involved in US DOT regulatory approvals. Now, we will have a separate workshop on November 20th to discuss these regulatory updates. So stay tuned. Next slide, please. Now, the last category is oxidizers. Oxidizers are substances that can cause or contribute to the combustion of other materials by providing oxygen or another oxidizing element. While they don't burn themselves, they may help ignite or intensify a fire. Common examples of oxidizers include hydrogen peroxide, potassium permanganate, and nitrates. These substances can significantly increase the risk of fire when in contact with flammable materials. Now, in the oxidizers subsection, California is still having an old system of classification for explosives where the old US DOT regulations are cross-referenced. US DOT had modified its classification system for explosives years ago, and US EPA had already modified its regulations accordingly. So now, the existing US EPA's regulations reflect the most current US DOT standards. while California is still using outdated references. We will share further details about these differences in the updates section later today. Next slide, please. Now, after understanding ignitability and its various types, we need to consider the current California regulatory requirements for managing ignitable hazardous waste. Here you can see the blue represents federal criteria for ignitability, while green for California. They were same at the time of establishment, as initially California mirrored the federal language for this characteristic. So both set of regulations for ignitability were the same at the time of development of these regulations. Next one, please. However, over time, the situation has changed. While the California for ignitability remain the same between California and federal regulations, certain subsections have some differences in the regulatory language. This is because the US EPA has revised its ignitability criteria several times, where California has not adopted all of these recent changes. As a result, although the regulations were once identical, some variations have emerged over time. We will discuss these differences in depth later today. With that, our discussion about ignitability criteria is completed. And let's move towards the second characteristic criteria, which is the characteristic of corrosivity. Next one, please. All right. Corrosivity is based on how acidic or basic a water-based solution is, or how fast a liquid can corrode metals. That means the corrosive wastes are highly acidic or alkaline substances that can corrode or dissolve materials like metal, flesh, or other substances. These are some of the common hazardous wastes, such as waste sulfuric acid from automotive batteries. The criteria of corrosivity characteristic is outlined in the Title 22, Section 66261.22. Now, after understanding what a corrosive waste refers to, we will be discussing about the reason why was corrosivity considered a hazardous waste characteristic at first place. Next slide, please. So, corrosive wastes were classified as hazardous due to the significant risks they pose. These wastes can burn skin, damage eyes, and even destroy the containers they are stored in, such as metal tanks and pipes. If containers fail, the waste could leak, contaminating the environment and harming ecosystems, water supplies, and the public health. Several incidents of waste leakage with severe environmental and public health impacts led the US EPA to regulate corrosive matter waste under the characteristic criteria. Now, it's important to note that corrosivity is one of the two characteristics where California's regulations are broader in scope than the federal regulations. Let's take a look how this differs. Next one, please. California's regulations differ from those of the US EPA because federally, corrosivity for liquid waste is determined by using one of the two criteria. First one is through determination of the pH, where the aqueous waste with a pH of 2 or lower means highly acidic, or 12.5 or higher means highly basic, are considered corrosive. The second way of determination is through corrosion rate, where a liquid is classified as corrosive if it corrodes steel at a specified rate. California also uses the similar federal corrosivity criteria for liquid waste. However, California takes a broader approach. Next one, please. So, in addition to these two federal criteria, California includes two additional criteria to account for the corrosivity of solids. This makes California's regulations more comprehensive, ensuring that solid corrosive waste, which is not classified as hazardous under US EPA's regulations, is considered non-RCRA hazardous waste in California. These expanded regulations provide better management and oversight of hazardous materials, especially in cases where solid corrosive waste could pose risks to health and the environment. This concludes our discussion on the corrosivity criteria. Now let's move to the next characteristic, the characteristic of reactivity. Next one, please. The third criterion we are discussing today is the characteristic of reactivity, which is based on whether a waste could readily explode or react dangerously. which means that the reactivity characteristic identifies waste that can cause explosions, violent chemical reactions, or release toxic gases under normal conditions. So, if not properly managed, these wastes pose significant risks. Examples include cyanide or sulfide bearing waste, explosive materials like munitions, and chemicals like sodium metal that react with water. Proper regulations and management are crucial to prevent accidents. The criteria of reactivity characteristic is outlined in the Title 22, Section 66261.23. Before we go into more detail, let's explore why reactivity was selected as one of the key hazardous waste identification criteria. Next slide, please. The reactivity characteristic of hazardous waste was established for the same reasons as the other criteria, which is to protect human health and the environment. We have seen in the past how dangerous incidents occurred when reactive waste were mishandled. These events highlighted the need for regulations to prevent future accidents. For example, in the 1970s in Southern California, a deadly incident occurred when phosphorus oxychloride, a reactive chemical, mixed with water inside a 55-gallon drum. This caused a violent chemical reaction that released steam and hydrogen chloride gas. The intense pressure from the reaction caused the drum to explode, sending its bottom piece flying over 100 yards. Unfortunately, the blast fatally injured a plant operator nearby. This tragic event underscores the danger of improper handling and storage of reactive chemicals, especially when exposed to water, which can lead to deadly explosions like these. Next one, please. Another incident in Southern California involved a drum containing toluene diocyanide. After exposure to rainfall at a disposal site, the drum experienced a dangerous pressure buildup and it exploded. Although no injuries were reported, this event underscored the need for careful management of reactive waste. These examples demonstrate why the reactivity characteristic is essential to ensure these materials are safely identified, handled, and disposed of. So, this helps us avoid similar accidents, safeguarding both public health and the environment. Next one, please. Now, after discussing why reactivity is one of the criteria, here is what it refers to. The reactivity characteristic applies to wastes that are unstable, react dangerously with water, or produce toxic fumes under normal conditions. It also includes materials that can detonate, explode, or react violently under normal conditions or when confined. Most reactive wastes are regulated under US DOT rules for hazardous materials and explosives. Since no standardized tests exist for reactivity, the waste generator's knowledge is crucial for handling and classification. Due to their unpredictable nature, the US EPA uses narrative criteria and information about the waste properties to define reactive wastes. Reactivity is the second characteristic, like ignitability, that initially aligned with both California and US EPA standards. However, regulatory language of some subsections of California's current regulations no longer match those of the US EPA's regulations for this characteristic. Let's explore why this change occurred. Next one, please. The differences between California and US EPA reactivity criteria arose over time for specific regulatory reasons. Similar to the ignitability criteria, initially California's regulations adopted the US EPA's regulatory requirements for reactivity as they were when they were first developed. Next one, please. However, over time, the situation has changed for the same obvious reasons, like we discussed for ignitability characteristic earlier, where US EPA has modified its reactivity criteria several times, but California lagged behind. That's why some of the regulatory references in the existing reactivity criteria for California now differs from US EPA's regulations for federal, even though they were once the same. DTSC recommends adopting these US EPA modifications, which we will briefly discuss later today. Additionally, a workshop is planned for next month to further explore these changes and DTSC's recommendations. With this, We have completed our overview of the reactivity criteria, and at this point, we will take a short break of 5 minutes to grab water, coffee, or stretch a bit. After the break, we will move on to the fourth identification criterion, characteristic of toxicity, and Trent Smith will explain the details. So right now it's 11:11. Let's meet back at 11:16, and then we will recontinue. Thank you very much.
I think there might be a slide.
No. Just the back.
Okay. Okay, we're gonna get started up back here in a couple of seconds. We're waiting on one more person to come on back in. It's a nice stretch.
We could go ahead and go to the very next slide anyway,
Yeah.
if you would, please. Yeah, there we go.
And we'll be touching the, I see a few questions in the chat and in the question and answer, and we'll go through questions at the end. Trent has it's gonna be covering the toxicity characteristic.
All right, thanks, Lubna. I'm going to finish our discussion of California's criteria for the characteristics of hazardous waste by looking at section 66261.24 of Title 22, the characteristic of toxicity. There are 8 paragraphs in subsection A, which spell out the criteria. And for today's purposes, I'll organize those into 5 groups. First, we have the federal toxicity characteristic leaching procedure, or TCLIP. And the rest are the non-RCRA criteria, including persistent and bioaccumulative toxic substances, 4 different direct measurements of toxicity to animals, a list of carcinogenic substances, and a criteria for other waste shown through experience or testing to be toxic in various ways. The first of these is the toxicity characteristic leaching procedure, which is the only criterion for this characteristic under the federal regulations. Since it is a federal criterion, which DTSC has no ability to modify, I won't focus for long on it, but it is helpful to examine because it is so similar to one of the non-RCRA criteria. The TCLIP was designed to predict one specific aspect of a waste potential toxicity based on what would happen if a waste containing toxic chemicals was thrown away and disposed at the same place where our household garbage goes, a municipal landfill. Let's think about what would follow if that happened. What other kinds of waste are disposed into these kind of landfills? And besides garbage, what else finds its way into a landfill? Well, today in California, we encourage composting of food and plant waste. But when the TCLIP was developed, that was not the case. And so you have lots of rotting food waste and plant material, generating acids as those decompose, and then mixing with the rain that falls on the landfill. So any waste would be exposed to that mildly acidic mixture, and this tends to draw out or leach toxic chemicals such as heavy metals or organic pollutants. According to the way that landfills were designed in the years when the TCLIP was developed, that toxic slurry might percolate down through the landfill and into the soil beneath the landfill, and those chemicals could potentially reach groundwater. So we now see that the TCLIP was really designed to protect drinking water sources. It does this by simulating the conditions in a landfill and providing results that show the toxic potential of a waste, all in a test that's completed in about a day. To do that, the waste sample is ground up if necessary, and a somewhat acidic solution is added to it. That mixture is tumbled for 18 hours, after which any remaining solids are filtered out and the liquid portion is analyzed to see what toxic chemicals were extracted. Now, if the waste was a liquid to start with, then that's analyzed directly. Here's a list of toxic chemicals that we look for in the T-clip extract and their regulatory thresholds. If one or more of these chemicals concentrations in the extract is equal to or over its threshold, then the waste is a RCRA hazardous waste, unless excluded. All the rest of the ways that a waste can exhibit the characteristic of toxicity are non-RCRA criteria, including the next one, the persistent and bioaccumulative toxic substances. I think that the term persistent is pretty self-explanatory, but in case anyone is unfamiliar, the term bioaccumulative refers to the tendency of some chemicals, once they enter the body of an individual, to not be metabolized away or excreted or otherwise lost. Instead, with continued exposure, the levels of such a chemical will only continue to increase over time, often reaching a point where they're toxic. This is a form of chronic toxicity, which is when a poison acts more slowly, more incrementally, and often has effects that are not necessarily lethal, but are detrimental nonetheless. The persistent and bioaccumulative toxic substances standard in California's characteristic of toxicity actually consists of two ways that a waste can qualify. First is by the waste extraction test, or WET. This test has a similar purpose and design as that of the T-clip. In fact, now that I've unpacked the T-clip for you, the easiest way to explain the WET is just to show you how the two tests are different. Both use an acidic extraction, but the buffer that maintains the pH is different for the two. The T-clip uses acetic acid, while the WET uses citric acid, and at a higher concentration. Also, the T-clip extraction dilutes its waste more and proceeds for less than half as long as the WET, which takes 48 hours. All of those factors, especially the use of citric acid, causes the WET to extract toxic metals at higher concentrations than the T-clip. One more thing to note before we move on is that the list of chemicals that are analyzed under each is an overlapping set, but also each test examines for chemicals that the other one ignores. Similar to the T-clip, the results of the chemical analyses are compared to thresholds, and the ones for the WET are known as the soluble threshold limit concentrations, or STLCs. I'll show you what those are in a minute, but first, let's look at the other way that a waste can be hazardous under this paragraph. That's by a test that looks at the total chemical composition of the waste, not just the part that leaches out in a simulated landfill analysis. The idea of this standard was to protect Californians from other ways that a waste could harm them, such as by contaminated soil being eaten by a child. The results from this test are compared to a different set of thresholds called the total threshold limit concentrations, or TTLCs. Of the chemicals regulated as persistent and bioaccumulative toxic substances, some are also on the T-clip table. Ones that are not on the T-clip table, and so they are regulated by the characteristic of toxicity only in California, are indicated in this table that I put together with pinwheels out to the right side of each chemical's name. The thresholds for about half the chemicals were based on US EPA drinking water standards that were in effect at the time the STLCs were adopted. So these thresholds were based on the chemical's potential chronic effects on human health. In the years since these values were established, the drinking water standards for some of these have changed, some becoming more stringent than they were, and some becoming less so. The thresholds for most of the other chemicals were derived from a value that measures their toxicity to fish, which was seen as representing their toxicity to the environment. For all of the standards we've discussed so far, that is the T-clip, the WET, and the totals, a waste is toxic if the concentration of the regulated chemical is at or above the threshold. So for these, if you are a waste generator, hoping that your waste is not hazardous, you'd be wanting the analytical levels to be under the lines, kind of like a game of limbo. Now, that's not true for the next set of criteria, which are 4 direct measurements of how toxic a waste is to animals. In adding these criteria to the regulations, the department was acknowledging that we don't know all the chemicals that might be toxic. So these measurements allow us to account for those unknown toxicities and make sure that Californians' public health and the environment are protected. The first 3 are based on tests done on mammals, rats and rabbits, which serve as surrogates for humans. These 3 are really aimed at discerning the effects of a waste on human health. The first is a standard for a waste's acute oral LD50. Now, as we've mentioned, the word acute indicates that we're looking for a drastic effect on health, in this case, death, that occurs quickly as a result of a powerful dose. That dose, the lethal dose for 50%, is the one that will kill half a test population of rats after a given amount of time. And this one is for the oral dose. In other words, the material is being fed to the rats. That's similar for the next one, the acute dermal LD50. The differences are that this test is done on rabbits and the material is put on the skin of the rabbit instead of being fed to it. For both of these first 2 being LD50s, you'll see that the threshold value that determines whether a waste is hazardous or not is based on how much of the chemical is being given per the animal's body weight. The last of the mammalian acute toxicity measures is the acute inhalation LC50 for gases and vapors. This is another test done on rats, and it is the concentration in air that kills half the population in a specified time period. For all of these 3, since what we're looking for is a dose or a concentration that kills, I hope that you can see that the smaller that number is, it means the poison is more toxic. So for that reason, a waste will be hazardous if its values for these are less than whatever the threshold value is. Or in other words, if you're a generator hoping that your waste is not hazardous, you'd be rooting for your waste values for these to be above the line, kind of like the high jump competitions many of us recently watched at the Olympics. Now I'll show you the thresholds for each of these measurements of toxicity. When they were first adopted, these were based on values that the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH, found to represent high health hazards. We can advance to the next slide, please. Thank you. And those values were then multiplied by a safety factor to account for things like the fact that a chemical will often have chronic health effects at lower concentrations than the levels that acutely kill rats or rabbits. Also, for these 3 criteria, most waste generators use their knowledge of the chemical constituents of the waste, along with those chemicals' known acute toxicities, and perform a calculation to tell them whether their waste is over or under the threshold. However, the same cannot be said for the last of the acute toxicity criteria, which examines a waste toxicity to the environment, specifically to fish. This criteria is based on a test that is designed to find the acute aquatic LC50, the concentration of waste in water that kills half a test population of fish within 96 hours or 4 days. There are 3 species of fish specified for this test in California's regulations, and a procedure which was developed by the Department of Fish and Game, as that department was known at the time. The standard was put in place to prevent situations like that used to occur when companies would back their trucks up to lakes or streams and directly dump their wastes in the water, often resulting in fish kills. The threshold of 500 milligrams per liter was based on US EPA's observations of chemicals that either had or had not caused fish kills when released into aquatic ecosystems. Unlike the 3 mammalian toxicity standards shown above, there is no calculation-based approach specified in California's criteria for this test. The second to last non-RCRA criteria for the characteristic of toxicity is a list of 16 carcinogens, or cancer-causing chemicals that were known and regulated by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Most of these chemicals are ones you've probably never heard of, and most of them are on the federal P list or U list. Now, as we discussed, being on one of those federal lists means regulation of unused chemicals that are either in their pure form or found as sole active ingredients. So if a plastics manufacturer here in California started a reaction using acrylonitrile, for an example, and that was one ingredient among several, and then that reaction got interrupted before it was completed, the waste from that aborted process is not a listed hazardous waste, though it may be identified by one of the RCRA characteristics. But the fact that the chemical is on this list would mean that in California, the waste from that reaction would be regulated. That's because a waste is hazardous in California if any of these chemicals is found at a single or combined concentration of 0.001% or greater by weight. Last, a waste is toxic and hazardous if it has been shown through experience or testing to pose a hazard, due to its carcinogenicity, acute toxicity, chronic toxicity, bioaccumulative properties, or persistence in the environment. This criterion was put in place to capture any waste that were toxic in one of the ways listed here, but it wasn't identified by any of the other 7 criteria for toxicity. However, notice that there are no thresholds or other metrics given here. For that reason, this criterion could potentially be interpreted in many different ways, which would make it difficult for generators to know if their waste are identified by it or not. So the legislature added Health and Safety Code section 25141.5, in which subdivision A requires DTSC to adopt a regulation if we use this criteria to identify any waste as hazardous, and if that determination would apply beyond just one generator. We can see how this all is played out by looking at an example of a waste that the department used to identify as hazardous under this criterion, ethylene glycol-based antifreeze. Even though it doesn't tend to kill rats or fish at a level that would cause most antifreeze to be hazardous waste under any of the criteria we've already seen, it is quite toxic to many other animals, including humans. However, DTSC has not adopted a regulation classifying ethylene glycol as hazardous, and so we cannot use this criterion to make a blanket statement about antifreeze waste anymore. Now, that's not to say that antifreeze is never hazardous waste, but the generator would have to make their determination based on other criteria. Well, that's all the criteria for the characteristic of toxicity, which means we've finished the 3rd point of our agenda. Now to look at where our current efforts are focused and the upcoming next steps. I'll organize these in 3 types of evaluations that we're working on, starting generally with ones that will take the longest and moving toward one that's closer to coming to fruition. First, we're looking for chemicals or waste that pose emerging threats to human health and the environment. One example of what's on our radar is a class of chemicals known as the per- and polyfluorinated alkyl substances, also called PFAS, and sometimes referred to as forever chemicals. As that nickname indicates, these chemicals do not tend to break down much in the environment, but they do tend to bioaccumulate in our bodies and in the bodies of other animals. For these chemicals, the US EPA has also started to do more regulation. And so our approach has been to prioritize the other facets of what we're required to evaluate under SB 158 while we wait and see what happens at the federal level. Generally, this examination of emerging contaminants is one that we never really expect to finish. DTSC will have to remain continuously vigilant to protect California from new waste streams that emerge as technology and manufacturing evolve. Next, we're also evaluating the regulatory thresholds for the non-RCRA criteria. These are the numbers that have been shown on some of my tables today, such as the STLC for copper or the TTLC for zinc. About those, we're asking questions like, are they protective enough based on new understandings of those components' toxicities? Or have conditions changed in the years since those values were developed so that the level of stringency they provide now doesn't match their current known threat to human health or the environment? One of the ones we're examining is the STLC and TTLC for lead. There is no known safe level of lead exposure, and the lead level in drinking water at which US EPA requires actions is now much lower than the drinking water standard that was in place when the STLC was developed. At the time, the protection afforded by at the same time, the protection afforded by municipal landfills, which you'll remember is the scenario on which the waste extraction test is based, is much stronger than it was when the regulations were developed. That will be a topic that we will discuss in our upcoming workshop on November 6th. We're also looking at the STLCs and TTLCs for metals that are not regulated under the TCLIP. Some examples include copper, nickel, and zinc, as well as their compounds. You may remember that these are some of the chemicals I told you were regulated primarily due to their toxicity to fish. And some of the same considerations about the increased protection afforded by modern landfills may also apply to them. And we're also looking at the acute aquatic 96-hour LC50. I told you just a few minutes ago that the threshold value in California's regulation was chosen because it was observed that chemicals with more potent toxicities tend to cause fish kills when spilled into aquatic ecosystems. We're evaluating whether that threshold still matches the realistic mismanagement scenarios we see today. DTSC's evaluation of this threshold is mandated by Senate Bill 1793 of 2022, which also requires us to look at other aspects related to this criterion, including its analytical testing method. For the fish bioassay, we're required and have begun to look at alternative methods with an emphasis on reducing or eliminating the suffering and death of test organisms, which in this case are juvenile fish. New approach methodologies that are being explored worldwide, or perhaps the utilization of a different kind of test organism altogether, may provide a path to a criterion that achieves equivalent or even superior protection to the environment while reducing the harm done to fish due to testing. And last, for this slide, we're starting to take a hard look at the wet. A study done in the 1990s as part of the regulatory structure update found that the citric acid buffer used in the wet causes an overestimation of the solubility of some of the regulated metals when compared to extractions using real-world landfill leachate samples. DTSC plans further scientific evaluation of that study and to determine whether it would be of value to do a new comparison using modern landfill leachate. All of the aspects of the criteria shown on this slide represent evaluations which DTSC has determined to be long-term projects. For most of these, we have completed or nearly completed evaluations of their regulatory history, a project to rebuild institutional knowledge that had been scattered over the years. For many of them, we are at the stage of determining what kinds of further scientific studies need to be done in order to inform the recommendations we make and any changes to regulation we may propose. We need to first understand how any proposed changes to a threshold or a testing procedure would affect the existing protection to human health and the environment. This work is critically important to get right. Once a regulation is on the books, there's the possibility it'll be there for 40 years. However, there are some changes to our analytical testing methods that will be proposed via a rulemaking much sooner. For that, I'll turn the presentation back over to Lubna Durrani.
Thanks, Trent. All right. A part of the future steps is to share some updates on upcoming rulemaking processes, which means that, can we move to the next slide, please? So, which means that along with our recommendations, we are also focusing on modifying few sections and updating some old or outdated criteria. So I will explain this set of updates in two ways. First set of updates are about the modernization of analytical test methods. And the second set of updates is about the modification of the information, which is either old or is outdated. Now, let's discuss these updates one by one. So the first updates are the modernization of the analytical testing methods, mainly in ignitability criteria, to stay consistent with current US EPA regulatory standards and to remain up to date. For example, modernizing the analytical tests for flashpoint determination of ignitable liquid waste and for determination of ignitable compressed gases. Next slide, please. And the second part of the updates also include modification of old or outdated information in some of the waste criteria sections, which needs modification. For instance, in both ignitability and reactivity criteria, as we have mentioned earlier, there are some sections which carry references to the old or obsolete information and needs to be updated. I'll now briefly go over these updates to provide a clearer picture of the specific changes and their implications. These updates aim to bring the regulations in line with current scientific standards by revising the criteria sections that need changes. I'll talk about these updates briefly for next few minutes. Next one, please. So let's look into the first part of the update include the modernization of some analytical test methods in the ignitability criteria. Now, as you heard, this process will involve a full rule-making procedure to ensure that the regulations are accurate, relevant, and reflective of the latest advancements in hazardous waste management program. Next one, please. Such as the test methods for determining ignitability of liquid waste using flashpoint. Now, we already know that the flashpoint is a parameter used to determine liquids ignitability criteria, and those are using the standards of American Society for Testing and Materials, which is abbreviated as ASTM standards. And as I mentioned earlier, the flashpoint is the temperature at which a liquid can produce enough vapor to ignite. You have heard me earlier discussing the differences between state and federal regulatory requirements for some ignitability sections, which were initially aligned but not anymore. And that's because California had not adopted several modifications of US EPA regulations over time. The US EPA recently introduced two new flashpoint determination tests for liquid waste, about which we had discussed briefly during one of our previous workshops, which was held on April 16, 2024. A link to this previous workshop will be added in the chat for your reference. But to recap, California still uses the three outdated flashpoint methods, which are represented in brown boxes here. These standards were published in 1970s and 80s, as the 2 digits to the end of the standard represents the year of its publication. While the US EPA adopted two newer ASTM standards, which as the last 2 digits indicate, were published in 2018 and are represented in blue boxes here. These methods replaced old mercury thermometers with safer modern digital devices. So now the US EPA has all these 5 test methods, including 3 old and 2 new test methods for liquid waste determination in the ignitability criteria, while California is still having 3 old test methods. DTSC recommends California to adopt these modifications to stay consistent and up to date with current science. Furthermore, the US EPA also updated rules for ignitable compressed gases and oxidizers to align with current US DOT regulations, which I'll explain briefly momentarily. As a reminder again, US DOT is an abbreviation for US Department of Transportation. You will hear me using this abbreviation multiple times for the next few minutes. Next one, please. Now, as I mentioned, the next is modernization of the test methods for ignitable compressed gases, where there is an update needed to remove obsolete information pertaining to US DOT old regulations, which are still referenced in the existing California ignitability criteria for compressed gases. To explain a bit, currently California uses outdated cross-references, including these three old test methods approved by the Bureau of Explosives, which is abbreviated as BOE under US DOT, which are flame projection tests, the open and the closed drum apparatuses. Now, all of these three test methods are no longer in use for determining of compressed gases. Even the BOE is not an approving entity under US DOT since several years, rather several decades. So California's existing regulations still refer to the now obsolete BOE's methods, which are no longer valid or in use. Let's see how existing regulatory requirements of US DOT are cross-referenced by US EPA. Next one, please. So these are the existing criteria of ignitability determination of compressed gases in the federal regulations, as the US EPA has already updated its regulations to align with the current US DOT's revised updated methods. Therefore, the US EPA removed the outdated references to BOE methods and adopted the testing standards that US DOT now requires, which are ASTM standards E681-85 or any other equivalent methods approved by PHMSA, which is the abbreviation of the Associate Administrator Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. Now, to remain consistent, DTSC recommends updating the cross-references to the new US DOT approved methods, allowing to navigation to the current test methods rather than those that no longer exist. Next slide, please. The second part of the updates focuses on revising outdated information within some of the waste criteria sections that required modification. Over time, certain references and regulatory details in the criteria have become outdated and no longer reflect current standards or practices. This is especially true in the sections related to ignitability and reactivity criteria, where some subsections still contain references to older or obsolete information. One of the examples is the 4 additional notes at the end of the ignitability criteria, which is codified in Title 22 of Section 66261.21. These notes are outdated or unnecessary to understanding the regulations. For instance, note number 1 is about the Bureau of Explosive test methods for the determination of ignitability of compressed gases. You just heard me a few minutes earlier about this outdated information. Notes number 2 and 3 details a function of the 2 defunct programs by stating that they have ceased operations on February 20th, 2005. And also that both of these programs have moved to another program, which is called the PHMSA PHMSA under US DOT. Now, it has been approximately 20 years that this change has occurred. Therefore, this historic information, which is provided by these additional notes, is no longer necessary to understanding the regulations. The US EPA has already removed these additional notes, and DTSC agrees with this modification and recommends following the US EPA's efforts to update and clarify the regulations, ensuring that they are streamlined and up to date. There are some other examples which either are old or outdated information. Let's look at some of them. Next one, please. Such as in ignitability criteria. California is using old classification system for explosives based on old US DOT standards. Title 22 of the section 66261.21 A4IA references a class A explosives or a class B explosives. The terms class A and B explosives came from the classification system for explosives used by US DOT before 1990s. Later, US DOT revised its classification system for explosives, which was based on the United Nations recommendations on the transport of dangerous goods as a part of a final rule. However, California is still having this old classification system. Let's see what is the existing US DOT classification system, which is already adopted by US EPA. Next one, please. So the new system replaced the use of explosive classes A and B with the classification codes of 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, etc. One thing to note is that this classification system has been modified by US DOT years ago. The US EPA has already updated its regulations as we just shared, and their regulations now matches with the changes which are pertaining to this explosive current classification. DTSC recommends that California revise its regulations to align with the current US DOT classification system, as this change will modify the regulations to provide the correct citation and to ensure consistency and alignment with current US EPA's regulations for federal. Next one, please. A similar situation is there for the reactivity characteristic, where the same cross-references of old classification system for explosives are codified in the Title II, Section 66261.23A8, which were based on the old US DOT classification system. As now we know that the current US DOT uses divisions, which are 1.1, 1.2, etc., to classify explosives, and it's already adopted by US EPA. California's existing regulations are since referencing to the older classification system. DTSC recommends updating both the ignitability and the reactivity criteria to modify the old to new classification in order to align with the current US DOT classification system and to ensure consistency with US EPA's regulations. As we wrap up, I encourage you to stay tuned for the upcoming workshop on November 20th, where we will dive deeper into these changes and discuss necessary updates in detail. The link to this upcoming workshop is shared in the chat for your reference. With that, our today's workshop for understanding hazardous waste criteria concludes. We are now open for any questions or feedback you may have. Thank you for your attention, and moving on to the next slide.
All right, thanks a lot. It looks like we have some questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to go ahead and read them out loud. That way they are part of the transcript, so please bear with me. Our first question comes from an anonymous attendee. Certain hazardous substances are not regulated under RCRA, but under other acts such as the Toxic Substances Control Act. PCBs and related contaminated media and petroleum, oil refining, hydrocarbon substances, and contaminated media. Are these excluded under California laws and regulations from being managed as hazardous waste?
I'll go ahead and take that one. For PCBs, it depends on the concentration. The PCBs at certain concentrations are regulated under TSCA. Others are regulated under RCRA. For the other waste streams that are asked about, we're going to have to go back and look into all of which exclusions or exemptions may apply. Petroleum, oil refining, and hydrocarbon substances is a very broad set of wastes. So if you do have a specific question about something within those specifically, encourage you to go ahead and send it over to our email address and submit that specific question there, and then we can go and follow up on it.
Thanks, Ryan. Next, we have a question from Swad Mila. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I apologize if not. Do products that have FKPUM listed ingredients required to be posted on the product's label for the consumer to know?
You want to take that one?
Sure, I think so. I have not seen such requirements. I've not seen that on the labels of products. We don't regulate products unless those products become wastes. And so that's not really for us to say, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I haven't either.
Sometimes I've seen information on the safety data sheet, but you can't always, it's not a complete, always a complete tool for doing the waste classifications, but sometimes you'll see it on the safety data sheet.
Thanks, Sean. Next, we have a question from Samantha Hahn. Could you explain the TCLP, STLC, and TTLC testing results in more detail? Specifically, how do 10-fold and 20-fold dilutions work, and how is the difference between them determined?
I can take that one, sure. So let me explain this first in the context of the order of the tests that many generators find useful to do. Because in California, you're going to be under all three of the totals, the wet and the T-clip. Many generators find it handy to start by doing the total digestion first. The total digestion will give you the total concentration of each of the regulated chemicals in the waste itself. Then once you've got those numbers, first you would compare those against the TTLCs themselves, I suppose. And let's say for the moment that none of the regulated chemicals in your waste are over the threshold that is the TTLCs. The next thing you would then do is to look at the results of that total composition analysis and do a calculation to determine whether it even makes sense to do the T-clip or the wet, which of course bear their own expenses. And so one might not want to do them if they really is no need to do them. So what you would do in those cases is take, let's say the example I give is for lead. Okay, lead is regulated under both California and the T-clip and the wet and STLCs and TTLCs. So let's say you have a certain lead level in your waste, and it was in the total digestion. You would take that concentration, which would be given in milligrams of lead per kilogram of waste, and divide that by the dilution factor for each of the two tests. For the T-clip, that's a 10-fold dilution. So you would take your number of whatever value you got back for the lead concentration in your waste, divide that by that dilution factor for the T-clip, which is 10. And if the number that you get is at or above the T-clip threshold, then it's possible that your waste would fail the T-clip. And so you would likely choose then to do that analysis. On the other hand, if that value was far above the value, then you might choose to say, well, I expect that this would fail. And so you might not choose to do the test in that case. But either way, it's possible that your waste would fail the T-clip and be federally regulated RCRA hazardous waste unless excluded. Then if, let's say for example, or let's say for a minute that you did that, you divided the total concentration by 10 and found that, I just said 10, I botched that. I actually messed that up. For T-clip, it's 20.
Yes.
That's correct. I'm so sorry. I'm answering this question on the fly. I'm sorry, my apologies. For the T-clip, it's 20. Divide by 20 to determine whether you need to do the T-clip. If the number you get from that is below the threshold, significantly below the threshold, so you know that there's no possibility it would fail the T-clip, then you would divide by the dilution factor for the wet, which is 10. And I'm so sorry again for making that mistake earlier. 20 for the T-clip, 10 for the wet. If the number you get when dividing that total concentration by 10 is at or above the threshold, then it's possible that your waste would fail the wet, and therefore that it would be regulated as non-RCRA hazardous waste.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Trent.
I'm sorry for the mistake anyway.
No, I owe you an apology because I accidentally called you Sean earlier. So thanks a lot, Trent. I appreciate it. All right. So we have another question.
We have a Sean in the room.
Well, yeah, he's around there somewhere. We have another question. It's coming from Seth Heller. Will old fish bioassay waste determinations be invalidated if another less deadly method is prescribed?
Thank you, Seth. I'm not sure that we're going to speculate on that. I think we're right at the beginning of this evaluation, so we're not in a position to really discuss future considerations that might happen as we're just starting to get into this. So apologies for not being able to touch that just yet. It is something to take back for consideration. You want to?
I mean, I guess it would just depend on however that regulation gets worded, you know, when it
Yeah.
comes out, yeah. And if you have comments that you'd like to make toward that, we're happy to receive those as feedback.
Thanks, Ryan and Trent. We also have a question from Charles White. I'll be able to answer this actually. It asks, when will recording be available? We're going to go ahead and have that recorded this afternoon, and then it should actually take a little while to get uploaded to the internet. So we're hoping next week sometime, but we'll definitely keep you apprised if we have any changes. Finally, from an anonymous attendee, will lithium-ion battery incidents becoming more visible in our life and their hazards known, reactive, ignitable? Could lithium-ion batteries become a non-RCRA waste?
I mean, they are a waste. They are RCRA. They're currently a RCRA hazardous waste, and so I don't know that they would become a non-RCRA waste because it's regulated federally.
Yeah, this, what I have seen, what I've heard from my colleagues in discussion is that the statement from US EPA is that they generally recognize lithium-ion batteries that become waste as D003 reactive hazardous waste.
Yeah.
It looks like that's about it. We do not have any other open questions. Again, if anybody has any questions, go ahead and submit them in the Q&A box, but it looks like as of now, we don't have any.
I did see one in the chat, and I'll go ahead and read that. It's from, and the name's getting cut off, but it's from Kimberly. I don't see the last name. The question was, do non-RCRA hazardous waste get included in the G&H fee calculation? Yes, they do, unless there is an exclusion or exemption that applies. And then I'll go ahead and read off a few questions that came in the pre-workshop survey, just to have them here, so they're acknowledged that we received them. I believe I responded prior to the workshop for this first one to Marvin Spencer. The question was, what was the reason for codifying VSQG, very small quantity generator? So what was the reason for codifying VSQG definition, but not all the management practices under 40 CFR? What was the negative impact, the DTSC, that made them not adopt VSQG standards in 40 CFR? So if I remember correct, the question was related to GIR, and I referred that over to our GIR group. There is also a website specific to the GIR's generator improvements rules. And so if anyone's curious about that, that's the best place to go for information, is that website. The next question was, for generators, there are two different labeling requirements for used oil. Which one is required to be used? Can DTSC do a better job of informing generators of new regulations? I was informed by our local CUPA 2 months after the GIR went into effect. I speak with CUPA on a regular basis. So I can't address this first question. I'll have to go and do additional research, but it might be best to submit a question to us in writing via email, and then I can point it to the most appropriate group to tackle that question. And to address the second half, DTSC is working to do a good job to inform generators of changes. Just as some context, there's 100,000 generators or upwards of there pretty much each year for the last few years. So we are working to extend the reach as much as we can. The third one we received was related to ignitability and reactivity criteria test methods. So I'll just go ahead and read it. It was need help resolving issues with receiving TSDFs on periodic waste stream acceptance. The ignitability and reactivity criteria test methods that are not regularly used for unburned gun residues, which are collected via a HEPA vacuum from indoor range. It is uncommon to find labs to perform test methods for DOT Division 1.1, 1.2, or 1.3 explosives, or the California Class A or Class B explosives. I thank you for that comment. I can take it back and point it to maybe TransUnit. We'll try and find the best route for that. I think that was submitted by Christina. If you have additional information that you want to share or additional context for that, or please let me know and we can try and get somebody to talk you through that. Do you have anything new? No.
That's kind of a question about a specific waste stream.
Yeah.
So let's be able to get as much information as we can, give the best answer we can.
Yep. Okay, we are 6 minutes over. So I do want to really thank everybody again for attending. If you have questions related to criteria and specifically for the hazardous waste management plan project, please submit them. Send any feedback over to us via email. And once again, thank you. I do want to extend the thanks to our interpreters. As always, thanks for being here. And then folks helping out around our room with around our slideshow. And with that, I think we can close this one out, and we will see you in Wednesday next week. There's one on ignitability. Or on incinerable waste.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, and don't forget, there's a post-workshop survey as well. All of the feedback has really been helpful for making minor adjustments to the way we're presenting some of the material and slide decks. And so it's been very helpful. Thank you. Okay, with that, you can close it out.
All right, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.